I think Jeremy Corbyn had an issue with Jewish people.
So what could you change structurally in the system to make it more likely that
Rory became Prime Minister?
Big mistake. Don't ask me about my big mistakes in politics.
Would that be number one? Welcome to The Rest is Politics Leading with me, Alastair Campbell.
And with me, Rory Stewart. And today we have with us Sajid Javid, who is one of the most, I suppose, senior and experienced members of Parliament in the Conservative Party at the moment. I mean, he's been a cabinet minister in an enormous range of different departments.
6.
Running the NHS, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he oversaw the business department, he did culture, he was the Home Secretary, etc., etc. So a really, really good way at getting under the bonnet of real government, real administration. He became a minister very early on. We joined Parliament together in 2010, but he was a minister by 2012. So he's been really up there on the front bench for over a decade. He ran for the leadership, actually against me and against Boris Johnson, and then he ran the previous time too, and was a major contender in the leadership. I remember when we were in Parliament, he was regularly one of the great stars of the Conservative Party, and people talking about him as Britain's Obama. And that's partly because Sajid came in at a time, we'll talk about this a bit, where actually the Conservative Party had been very, very white. He was the first Muslim to hold one of the great offices of state in Britain. The Conservative Party's changed a lot since then, so that's something maybe to talk about. And he's about to leave politics. So this is a chance to get Sajid unbound, no longer worrying about exactly what position he's going to get next or where he's going, but to give us a sort of honest view on what it felt like to be a politician. Over to Alastair.
So can we start right at the beginning with your childhood? You were born in Rochdale.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yes, I was born in Rochdale,
but
1969.
Grew up mainly in Bristol.
Yeah, I was by the age of sort of 3 or 4, left with my parents and moved to Bristol.
And just give us a taste of your childhood in terms of, as Rory said, father from a pretty poor background. When he left Pakistan, got a okay job here, but you weren't exactly rolling in it in the way that eventually you were. So tell us about your childhood. And one thing I particularly want to ask you about is whether as a child of Pakistani heritage, growing up particularly in Bristol, when you've presumably got memories of that, whether you did suffer much racism and how that felt.
Yeah, so as Rory just said, so my parents were both from very poor sort of backgrounds from villages in Pakistan. My dad came over first before my mum, and his first job actually was on the cotton mills in Rochdale, and then he wanted to get a job on that was sort of more regular, paid more relatively, and applied to join what I think was the Greater Manchester Bus Company. Became a conductor. But you asked about racism. I'll just give you an example that he then passed on to me and my brothers, was that when he was a conductor, he wanted to become a driver. At that point, there were hardly any other drivers in Manchester that were not white. And there was no legal reason, but the union blocked it. And the union had rules, had a colour bar policy. And he told me this story. Informal. But they had. He told me that there were posters and so it was informal, but they had posters saying no coloured people to drive buses. And he went along to what was the recruitment office already as a conductor, and he queued up, got to the end, and there's a lady there who says, "I like an application form for to be a driver," and she said, "You can't." He said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because can't you read the sign?" And he said, "I know the law. I know I can do this." And she grabbed the paper, chucked it on the floor. You had to pick it up from the floor. And it took him 2 years to become a bus driver, and eventually became one of the first non-white bus drivers in Manchester. And so my parents faced racism. As a child, I can remember so many instances of racism. I can remember in Rochdale, even though I left so young, I remember walking in the streets as a child with my mum, being shouted at, normally Paki and sometimes other even worse stuff. And in Bristol, there were many incidences. I mean, from by then, my parents they wanted to have a business. My father first he did market stalls. My mum used to sew the clothes for the stalls, And then he eventually sort of graduated to a shop. He wanted a shop. We lived above the family shop. But I can't tell you the number of times that we woke up one morning and there's graffiti on the windows of the shop, packy bastards, packies out. And I'd feel so sorry for my parent. My mum would spend hours cleaning this graffiti while my dad would be trying to sell things in the shop.
I absolutely get why you'd have a kind of visceral reaction to that kind of thing. But I just wondered on the union thing, whether, because you've got quite a reputation as being a Thatcherite, certainly historically, does that explain maybe why you have a take on the trade unions that is, coming from where I am, is sometimes has felt a little bit extreme?
No, I don't think so. I think there's a great question in that. Would that had an impact on my thinking about unions? Look, I'm not anti-union. I never have been. I think unions play an important role, obviously for organised labour. But I would say that they have also, in the history of Britain, done many wrong things, and
That was
being
certainly one of them.
unaccepting of people that don't happen to be white was clearly wrong. There are many union members, unions that organised to support people like Enoch Powell and others when he said what he said, and so you had the sort of right and the left coming together.
One of the things I remember when we came into Parliament together is early conversations where you very, very politely and courteously got me up to your tiny little office in Parliament to talk about foreign policy and Afghanistan. But one of the things that made me wonder is how much of your Pakistani or Punjabi heritage you kept, because on the one hand, I think you talk about the fact your mother didn't speak very good English, so you were having to translate for her when she went to doctor's appointments. But did you ever go back to Pakistan? Did you ever see the villages they came from? How did that identity sit with you?
Yes, I'm very proud of that heritage, that identity. In fact, Punjabi was my mother tongue. I remember arriving at school at a very young age, not being able to speak English, and at the time I wouldn't have realised it, but today I'm very proud of that I can speak the language, and it meant when I did go to Pakistan, first as a child, but obviously that was my parents' choice. But more importantly, when I chose to go as an adult, I've taken my children to Pakistan. I've taken them to villages with my parents. In fact, just over a year ago, my father is sadly no longer with us, but one of his dying wishes to me and my brothers was that, please, if you ever can, take your children to my hometown, my village where he was born, which was on the Indian side of Punjab, south of Amritsar, in a town near Jalandhar, and which is now Indian Punjab. And he was part of that partition, and that obviously affected him a lot. And he almost died as a youngster moving from just outside Amritsar to Lahore. And I did that just over a year ago. I took all my children, my family, my wife, to his birthplace, the house that he was born in, the school that he went to in India. And if you ask my children today if they were here, and they've been very lucky, they've traveled a lot, they've had lots of nice holidays, been to very interesting places. If you ask all four of them today, what's the best sort of trip outside the UK you ever had that's impacted you the most, they would all say the visit to their dadu's birthplace.
But before we move on from this, Sadiq Khan, Humza Yusuf, Anna Sawa, you, I mean, there is a group across different parties, SNP, Conservative, Labour, of people who come from the Punjab, right? The Pakistani Punjab, most of them. Do you feel anything in common, or is that sort of, when you meet them, is there anything there that connects people?
Yes, I do. And all three of the people that you mentioned, obviously all in different political parties, different political traditions. I know them all. I would consider them all friends. I think they would say that. I've got to know them through politics, actually, and there is an affinity. There is a link. I mean, we can obviously have our different politics and the way we might vote, the things that we might say in Parliament and elsewhere. But there is a link, and I've worked with Sadiq Khan when I've been in ministerial positions, and we worked incredibly well, became friends. With Humza Yusuf when I was the Health Secretary of the UK. He was the Health Minister in the Scottish Government. We worked very closely together. Anas, I also know his father, who actually went on to be Governor of Punjab. And I feel proud of that in the UK today that you have, first of all, many more people in politics that are not white, that are from various backgrounds, be it black or Asian. But I guess in particular, to see more people of Pakistani heritage coming through.
I was going to come to this later, but given that Sadiq's name has
Yeah.
come up, it seems maybe I was saying, now you were one of the first people to come out and criticise Lee Anderson for what he said about Sadiq Khan, where he essentially said he was run by Islamists as opposed to, run by Londoners. And I think a lot of people listening to this will hear you say, as a politician that they know well through having been cabinet minister and so forth, but you're sitting there saying that you're friends with people of other parties. Is that something that you think that politicians don't say enough when they are actually on the front line in the big jobs where they're attacking each other the whole time? Because I think that's, I don't know what you thought there, right? I just thought, I think people would find that, oh God, first thing he said virtually is about his opponents, that they become friends.
Well, there are a lot of friendships, let's say, across the aisle in politics. And sometimes I find that some of those are probably more trustworthy, real friendships than with people on your own side. And certainly during my time in Parliament, I can say that I generally feel I have friends on the other side, as it were, and respect in the sense that, I might be standing there as a minister at the dispatch box and someone on the Labour side, let's say, gets up and says, that's all nonsense, don't agree with it. But they're doing their job. If that's what they really believe, then fine, fair enough. That's why they're in Parliament, to express their opinions. They might not even really believe it. Their whips might have told them to do it, but they've got a job to do, right? I've got a job to do. But I can think of so many times where I've worked with, especially as a minister, with MPs, particularly Labour, but I can think of DUP MPs, Liberal Democrat MPs, on issues that really matter.
Do you think Lee Anderson believes what he said? Do you think he believes that? Does he believe that Sadiq Khan is run by Islamists and has lost control of the streets of London?
Hard to say whether he really believes. I like to think not. Could he really believe it? Sadly, he may. He didn't apologise, right? He hasn't apologised. I mean, let's be clear. What he said was racist. It was anti-Muslim hatred in a very sort of blatant and one of the vilest forms. It was completely unacceptable. I know lots of ministers out there saying now it was wrong. Of course it was wrong, but it was much more than just like
Why are
wrong.
none of the current ministers saying what you've just said? And would you have said that when you were the Home Secretary?
Yes.
But why are none of them saying that? They've all been told, say it's wrong, say it's unacceptable.
I said similar when I was Home Secretary about others. I said similar about President Trump when he made some comments as Home
just sort of to bring the listeners in who are not professional politicians. I think Alice is trying to get into professional politics. It is a kind of bizarre, right? It's all over social media at the moment. Nick Ferrari will say to a minister, so you said it's wrong. Why is it wrong? And then the minister will say, it's wrong. And
it's wrong because it's wrong.
He'll be like, why is it wrong? And he'll be like, it's wrong. And they'll repeat like 7 times the same phrase. Yeah. Can you just, now that you're leaving politics, take the veil back and explain to the public, why does ministers say the same line 7 times?
Well, whether obviously this isn't a policy area as such, but there will be, I mean, both of you will be familiar with this, maybe particularly Alastair. There will be lines to take. Right, and the expectation
better crafted than the ones they've had for this.
And the expectation would be you would take those, right? They might be better crafted, right? Give you a bit more wiggle room, let's say. But I'm sure Alastair can think of many examples where he had to have a few words with someone when they didn't take the line, even though the line was pretty dumb.
So to explain, somebody in the centre has decided that ministers should be saying it's wrong and not say anything else.
Yeah.
And it's been written down on a sheet of paper. The guy's gone into the radio studio, it was written down. And I guess...
And also what happens is before they go into the studio, maybe that morning, if they're doing what's called the morning round, they'll have a chat with someone at number 10 or CCHQ, the sort of headquarters, and they'll say, by the way, you will get asked this, and all you can say is wrong. Do not cross the line. Do not cross the line.
And then they'll feel they won't get promoted if they cross the line. They'll be in trouble.
And some of them will be worried about promotions.
Yeah.
Some of them are just not good ministers and just weak, right? That's the reality. Is that I mean, were there things that I said as a minister that I didn't really want to put it like that? They wouldn't be my words. I was taken out. Of course there were, right? Of course there were. But there were also plenty of times where I just thought, you know what? This is just too important.
You've got to say
And you just got to say what it is.
Mm.
And whatever the consequences, damn the consequences, right? And sometimes the consequence might not quite be what you think. You know, for example, you remind me of something. You know, when I was the local government community secretary, the Windrush scandal had started. It was awful. I mean, I think I was reading about it, hearing about it, learning a bit more in government. Obviously, I wasn't in the Home Office, but everything I was hearing about it internally, reading externally, thanks to the excellent work of Amelia Gentleman and others and stuff, I thought, this is just terrific. This is like, these people are British, and I just cannot understand how this could have happened, right? And I remember being interviewed about it. As you know, obviously as a cabinet minister, it was the hottest topic. It had very clear lines. You must not admit it's a crisis. You must not say it's a scandal. You must defend the Home Office. I remember doing an interview, and I said, "Look, this is awful. This is it's a massive injustice." And then I said, "This could have been my parents. Like, this could have been my parents. Right? I just cannot understand it." I got a call that afternoon from number 10. I think I won't say who it was, but someone very senior saying, "Why did you say that? You've caused so much trouble."
Was the name Nick or Fiona?
No, actually, they had gone by then.
Okay.
Thankfully, they had gone, right? And I tell you, it was like on a something like the Saturday, I get this call saying, "You must." The Prime Minister sub said she wants to see you first thing. This is unacceptable.
And,
you cannot understand.
I'm going to interrupt just to explain to the audience why that would be. It's because the government's really worried. They're trying to hold the line together. They're worried that if you say this, it's going to create newspaper headlines that the journalists will try to use against the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister. Yeah.
And then, I think almost literally, I'm pretty sure the following day, I think the Sunday, Amber Rudd resigns.
And you got
Amber Rudd resigns, right? And Monday morning, I get a phone call. I do get that phone call from the Prime Minister about Windrush, really, but it wasn't to bollock me. It was to say, "Do you want to be? I would really love you to become the Home Secretary," right? And so
you had proven actually that, you see, what you've just said there reminds me. We used to have John Reid, Jack Cunningham, Margaret Beckett, Donald Dewar. We had several cabinet ministers who you could phone up and say, "This is the line, okay? This is the line to take." But then they would go out and they would speak like human beings. They wouldn't say something contrary to government line. So what you did there was actually, you didn't go across. In saying this could have been your parents, you weren't saying this is the government's fault necessarily. So that's the difference. And that's when you talked earlier about some ministers that aren't very good. That's what drives me mad about most of today's ministers. They sound like robots reading a script.
Too many of them sound like robots. Sometimes everyone knows, everyone's listening and think, "Come on, you just know, you should be better than this," right? And it's good, obviously, that they're saying it's wrong, which is better than not saying it's wrong, I guess. But it's not going far enough because, what Lee Anderson said is just totally unacceptable in politics. He shouldn't be as a result, especially if he just wasn't willing to issue any kind of sincere apology. And since then, obviously, he's doubled down, which makes me think, back to Rory's question, maybe he just didn't mean this. He really actually meant this, which is even worse in some ways. People do misspeak sometimes. It gets taken out of context. Isn't
he doing it? And aren't the government not sort of going overboard and saying the sort of things that you've just said, because they think there is a part of the electorate that can't have their own prejudices challenged, and that's dangerous. So actually, you've got a situation where senior politicians are saying, "We're not going to call out racism because there will be people there who will feel we're talking about them because that's what they think."
Look, I think clearly there's a reason why the lines to people are, don't go, say this much, but don't go any further. But it is clear, I think, that any sensible, reasonable person that, if you take this instance, your anti-Muslim hatred is as unacceptable as anti-Semitism, right? They're both completely unacceptable. This is, disliking someone, or worse, hurting them, discriminating them, calling for bad things to be done to them just because of the faith they've chosen to follow. And I saw both as community secretary, as home secretary, and now it's even worse for both of those communities. Both of those are suffering unacceptable levels of racism because of activities that are happening thousands of miles away, where the people who want to protest against that or make an issue of it, they can't just find a sensible civil way to do that, and they attack people from different communities.
One of the things I was always interested in with you is that in many ways you lived a very cosmopolitan life. As you said, you traveled as a child, you worked in Singapore, you worked for these big international organizations. But I noticed when you came to Parliament, you didn't spend a great deal of time talking about foreign policy. So even though you'd lived internationally, you spoke Punjabi, you had all that background, why was it you were not leaning in more to, the war in Afghanistan, or what was happening in Iraq, or Kashmir, or Israel-Palestine? Am I right that to some extent you focus more on domestic policy?
Not completely, because I've had a huge, long-running interest in foreign policy, foreign issues, long before I was in politics. And in fact, one of you talked about my banking career. My banking career was, most of it was in a field called emerging markets, which were basically developing economies around the world. And one of the things I liked about that particular work for the 20 years I did it was that it took me to some very interesting parts of the world, and I was as interested in the politics of those countries as the economics. The answer to your question, though, but it is right, the final point you make about not talking too much about these issues in Parliament, I think the short answer is really that I became a minister very early. And from 2012, I was elected in 2010, as you know, I was a minister, actually a PPS within 9 months, a minister in the Treasury by 2012, and there for almost a decade in various minister positions. So I tend to stick to my brief, because there's always if I start talking about, there are obviously, when it's foreign policy interests, you have the Foreign Office, the International Development Office. So privately, I would have discussions with ministers, including, I think, Rory, with you when you were in those portfolios. In fact, you remind me of something that there's no reason anyone knows it, but when I was George Osborne's PPS, and just before I became a Treasury Minister, Economic Secretary, a week before the reshuffle, George said to me, look, we're going to have a reshuffle next week. Don't tell anyone. And I think the Prime Minister is really minded to give you a ministerial job. What would be your dream job? And I said, Foreign Office. And then a week later, I sent to the Treasury as the Economic Secretary. I love that job. I guess it suited my sort of immediate skill set more. But actually, the job I wanted was Foreign Office.
Also, on foreign policy, because one thing that you were quite well known for, you very, very very strongly pro-Israel. I think you chaired Conservative Friends of Israel for quite a long time.
I haven't chaired it, no, but I am. Israel is a country that I have been very supportive of, and I think it's a country that is for all the right reasons an ally of the UK.
Yeah, and so that with what's going on now, this sort of links up with the Lee Anderson stuff. And as you said, you've got anti-Semitism, you've got Islamophobia. I noticed that you were using that phrase, anti-Muslim hatred.
Yeah.
Is that what you don't? What is this row within the Conservative Party about not wanting to use the word?
That surprises me a bit, because one of my great memories when we were at that BBC leadership debate together.
Yeah.
We were all on the stage against Boris Johnson. One of the things you did at the end of the debate is you challenged us all to sign up to an investigation into what you then called Islamophobia.
If I hadn't done that, it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
I mean, it might have happened if you become Prime Minister or I become Prime Minister, but I was a bit worried it might not happen with Boris Johnson, so that's why I did it.
Yeah. But in those days, you used the phrase Islamophobia, and now you tend to use anti-Muslim.
Well,
hatred.
actually, I think that particular debate, I used the phrase only because I think the question was phrased in that way, and we didn't have much time. I didn't want to sort of get into a sort of argument about definitions. But I do think I've looked at this a lot. I looked at it a lot as both Community Secretary and Home Secretary, and I think the correct term is anti-Muslim hatred, and the reason is that the definition of Islamophobia, particularly the definition that was, I think, put together by the APPG, a parliamentary group. And I met the leaders of that group at the time. It was, I remember meeting Saida Varsi, Anna Subri, there were others, and we had some, very good meetings. But I told them at the time, and it was a decision of mine in the Home Office at the time, not to use that term. because it was too broad, because it included saying to people, you can't criticize a faith. It was like a blasphemy type law, right? And in this country, for all the right reasons, we have freedom of expression, religion, and just as we should have a blasphemy law on Christianity, on Judaism, any other religion, all religions should be treated the same. But what was very clear, and has always been clear to me, is that because someone chooses to follow a particular religion, there's no reason that anyone can have to discriminate against them, to abuse them in any way. And that's why I think anti-Muslim hatred is the right term.
So would you say that your strength of feeling about the issue, and in particular what Lee Anderson and Suella Braverman said at last weekend, that you feel just as strongly as Saeed Avasi does about what he did, why it's so bad? It's just that there's an argument about what word to call it.
I think on the issue of Lee Anderson, I think that's probably correct. I mean, Saeed Avasi feels strongly on many issues, so I couldn't speak for her.
No, but on
really,
this issue,
on the Lee Anderson on the Lee
doesn't-
Anderson point, she's been really clear, and I think I've been very clear. So I think we would be in agreement on that. But there's one other point I just want to make on the Islamophobia versus anti-Muslim hatred in terms of definitions, is that as Home Secretary, I also received advice from the police, that fighting counterterrorism, fighting terrorism day in, day out, and other services. And the police, and this is public, it was published eventually, the National Police Chiefs Council, which represents all the sort of chief constables, they had given me very strong advice in 2019 that the definition of Islamophobia that the government is being asked to accept is far too broad and actually works against the interests of Muslims. It will feed extremism. And that is something as Home Secretary, of course, you're going to take seriously.
On language, have there ever been times, I mean, here you are today being very calm and moderate and mature discussion with the three of us. Have there ever been times in your career where you feel you have gone over the top with some of the things you said? I'm thinking about, you called momentum, I'm no fan of momentum, but you called them neo-fascist. There was a time where you were kind of suggesting that Jeremy Corbyn was a bit of a Holocaust denier. I mean, is that back to the point about when you're in the heat of the debate as a frontline politician that sometimes you can go over the top? Do you think that was going over the top?
Well, I mean, sometimes, look, first of all, can you go over the top? Sometimes, yes, you can, right? You're human, you're at the heat of the moment. And can you say something that you think on reflection is the wrong way to put it?
And would you have, on those occasions, would you have thought that?
On those, I mean, you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, I think Jeremy Corbyn had an issue with Jewish people, right? He had an issue, and I wasn't as well documented, and the number of people in his own party that believed he had a problem with Jewish people, and when I made some comments about him, he actually threatened to sue me, and I said I'd see you in court. And by the way, if I see you in court, you're going to take the stand and you're going to get questioned on your relationship with anti-Semitism. And he backed off. And so, on that particular one,
see you in court sounds quite aggressive.
Well, he's the one who he hired a lawyer. I mean, I don't know who was funding all this stuff from him, but he hired a lawyer, and I suddenly received this letter from him. But your question was, on that particular point, I don't. Not that, but I'm not saying there won't be others. I mean, I can't think right now, but I'm sure I can think of instances where I thought I went too far.
So can I bring you back to your time as a government minister, administration? One of the loveliest things I remember when I made it into the cabinet is you gave me a telephone call. And you said to me, Rory, I wanted to get you on the phone because you're taking over. First time, you're not junior minister anymore, you're cabinet minister. These are my bits of advice for taking over a department. Will you share with the audience a little bit, if you can remember, what your general advice is on taking over a department?
Well, I've done that quite a bit in that colleagues have often were asked, and even recently where they've become the head of a department for the first time. And so I think the sort of top things in my head would be, having run 6 of these 6 departments, is that no matter how much you think you're going to do and get done and things, it's not going to quite work out like that, because you're not totally in charge, right? First of all, obviously, you've got a boss, there's a cabinet. In a department, as you'll remember, Rory and Alastair, you'll know, you don't typically pick your junior ministers. The only people you end up picking are your SPADs, your special advisors. Everyone else is already there. The civil servants are obviously permanent, and they're going to be there a lot longer than you will ever be. So one of the first pieces of advice would be to just find like 2 or 3 things, maybe even just 2, that really, really matter to you, that really matter, where you think you're going to make a difference, and focus on those rather than trying to have like 10 things, right? Because you're just not going to achieve it. Second thing is to make sure you read everything that's put in front of you, basically the paperwork. You actually do it yourself, and that you challenge and where you want to.
You obviously didn't phone Boris Johnson when he got a job then.
Well, he didn't. Yeah, he never asked me for any advice like that. And so that takes a lot of time, right? There's some of the departments that I've been in, Home Secretary, obviously health and the pandemic and things. There's a lot of stuff. You can spend a lot of time at night just going through stuff, but you have to do it because there's no one can read it for you. They can give you summaries and stuff, but you have to really go through this yourself. And another piece of advice, maybe a bit more unusual, was that that be nice to all MPs, right? Be civil to all MPs, not just your own side, right? All MPs. So where I obviously, as a Secretary of State, MPs, as they should, will come to you with issues, either a policy issue or quite often a constituency issue. Those really matter to MPs, as my constituency issues have always mattered to me. But go out of your way to really help them out. Right. And it doesn't matter if they're a Labour MP, a Liberal Democrat MP, or Conservative, just treat them all the same. Because A, it's the right thing to do, first thing, because it's a constituency issue especially. But B, you're going to need those MPs one day, and they will remember that you really went out of your way.
We had an interesting case of this, didn't we, with MPs coming to Ed Davey when he was Cabinet Minister about the Post Office. I think it was Dominic Grieve, Oliver Letwin. And I was very surprised by that as a former minister, that if 2 of my colleagues had come to me, and those were pretty senior colleagues, weren't they? Right? Those were kind of big cheeses in the party coming to say, we have a really big problem with the Post Office. And he obviously decided to slightly say, well, I'm getting different advice from my civil servants. The department's telling me there's not a big deal here. Can you sort of think about why that might happen, why a minister might make that mistake?
Yeah, look, I don't know the specifics of that, of course, but ministers, absolutely, I can think of some instances where you will get advice and it's wrong, not correct, and and I'm not saying it's deliberate, right? Someone's sitting there trying to manipulate the minister necessarily, but why might that happen? There can be many reasons, but if you think of responsibility of government and how broad it is, you mentioned the Post Office. It's a government-owned company. It's got its own independent board, and then it reports into another government quango, or certainly did at the time, I think, called UKGI, which then reports into a couple of different departments, which then reports into 2 different ministers. If you just work your way through that chain, you can see how, especially with all the independents involved, there's a corporate body, there's a separate body, then eventually it gets to civil service. You can see how things can be lost in that, including like super important things.
Can I? You mentioned your time as PPS to George Osborne.
Yeah.
One of the things that Rory and I argue about a lot on this podcast is the impact of austerity, and whether it helped or harmed, and whether it's partly responsible for the pretty dire state that the country's in at the moment. And I just wanted to tie that to your experience in banking, and whether you agree with me or disagree with me that one of the reasons why populism was born, and one of the reasons why it's become so powerful, not just in the UK but in different parts of the world, is that the sense of the global financial crisis was that, quotes, shorthand, the people who caused it got away with it, and we, the public, are paying a price. And that's what's fueled a lot of inequality. It's what's fueled a lot of anger with politicians and with bankers. You'll know that bankers are not the most popular people in the world. So first of all, your assessment on austerity, and secondly, what your reflections are about what the modern banker is and does, and whether that has helped to fuel populism and inequality?
Well, first, you mentioned the global financial crisis, so sort of 2007, 2008, and then obviously it had a big impact on the election result in 2010.
Yeah.
That clearly the banking system screwed up. Lots of reasons why it screwed up, but one of the reasons, both in the UK and the US and others, was the poor regulation, and that was a decision by politicians. Right, so as you will remember, the entire regulatory framework of banking in the UK was changed by the then Labour government, and they made a big song and dance about it. But it's very clear how that then led to some of the problems. Now, you asked me about austerity. When the coalition government came in 2010, and it. I often, when I would get asked about austerity, obviously, especially then, it was very topical. I would say it's about government living within its means. And so I think you and I will probably disagree on this, in that I think the government, in terms of reining in public spending, trying to bring what was then a record budget deficit of more than 10% of GDP, trying to bring that down, and doing so over a number of years, I think the government had no choice, because if the alternative was to keep spending money that you haven't got, then I was worried at the time, and even looking back, I think it was right to worry that how the financial markets might react to that, because you might remember there were other countries that didn't rein its spending in time, like Ireland, like Greece, like Portugal. And they all had to have bailouts.
But when you reflect on where we are now, the state of the economy now, the levels of debt and borrowing and taxation now, you don't think there's a possibility? I know we've had Brexit, we've had COVID, all these other things. There isn't a possibility that actually some of the foundations for this mess were actually laid during that period?
No, I think actually things would be worse if we didn't have the controlled public spending that we had during the coalition years. And I'll give you an example of that. During 2010, 2015, the government it didn't eliminate the deficit. The original goal was to eliminate it. It managed to halve the deficit, which incidentally was the plan that Alastair Darling had, right? So they basically had implemented Alastair Darling's plan by the 2015 election. And then spending more or less was, by whether it's the IMF, World Bank, they considered the UK had it under control. Then the pandemic comes along, and the government spent, I think, an additional 400 billion that it wasn't planning to spend in total, with all the support, the health work, and all of that. That wouldn't have been. It's hard to think how that would have been possible if austerity, as you call it, or bringing spending under control, hadn't happened.
And just before we go back to Rory, what's your assessment of Brexit 8 years on from the referendum?
Well, look, I didn't support Brexit. My view hasn't changed. And I think that clearly, obviously, we've had Brexit, but the delivery of Brexit, if we call it that, not just because of the pandemic, and obviously that happened around the same time as we were leaving, then the war in Europe and things, there's lots of other things going on. I think hasn't lived up to what I think people who voted for Brexit, what they felt they were promised. That said, where do we end up as a country between sort of now and next 5 or 10 years as a result of Brexit? I think it's too early to tell.
Structurally, one of the problems, we were both on the Remain side during the Brexit thing, and a lot of the Brexiteers were arguing then that it was going to be terrific because you'd leave Europe, which was a relatively slow-growing economy, and you'd be able to create terrific trade deals with faster-growing economies, China, India, the US. But two things have changed since then. One is that the international security situation's changed. So the idea of betting heavily on China and integrating heavily with the Chinese economy doesn't look as smart now as it might have looked in 2016. And the second thing that's changed is that the world has actually become more protectionist. The US in particular is much less interested in free trade deals than it was in the past. And all over the world, tariff barriers are going up. So that in a way, the problem for, the kind of, I suppose, the free trade right of the Tory party that supported Brexit is that the world's changed since 2016. They weren't able to launch themselves into this wonderful world of free trade because other countries are much less interested. They're becoming more isolationist, more protectionist, which of course makes me think that we should be considering very, very strongly looking at something like rejoining the customs union, even if we weren't, even if we are not thinking about joining the EU again, because the world's changed since 2016.
Well, it has, for the reasons you've said, Rory, it has become harder to do trade deals. I mean, there have been some successes. The one with Asia, in particular, the CTTP, is a particular, but none of that replaces the agreement that it had existed with the EU, not just because of no tariffs, but all the non-tariff barriers as well. And you're right about also the US and China and all that as well. I felt even before, whether it's because of COVID or changes in US leadership, I always felt it was always going to be hard for the UK to do sort of big trade deals that are going to be clearly in the UK interest with these other big economies outside the EU. Now, we are where we are, and I think there is a case for having a deeper trade agreement with the EU. The current trade agreement has to be renegotiated anyway, and so whoever wins the next election, they should be looking to work with our EU partners to see especially how they can start removing some of those non-tariff barriers.
What's your assessment of the last 5 prime ministers? Cameron, May.
That's quite a broad question.
It's a broad question, but I'm sure you've thought about it. Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, who you voted for, and Sunak.
With great regret. Big mistake. Don't ask me about my big mistakes in politics.
Would that be number one?
It'd be certainly top of the right there. Toward the top of the list. It was a huge mistake to support Liz Truss.
Why did you do that?
I did it because I thought, and on this bit I was right, I think everyone was right that said it, is that I thought she was going to win anyway. And I thought naively that I would be able to help sort of moderate her because I was worried about what she might do. And obviously it turned out that first she did win, but she wasn't going to be listening to anyone. And then she was the author of all her own mistakes, the disaster that she was.
So when you say she was going to win anyway, is that where politicians make a judgment? Well, if they're going to win, I need to be a part of that team rather than the losing team.
Well, it wasn't so much. I didn't want another job. So, by then I'd had, I've done what I've done, what we talked about. I was already thinking, it's pretty certain in my mind, I hadn't sort of made my final decision. I was going to not stand in the next election. So I was just thinking about what's going to be the direction of the country now. So Boris obviously had gone, and I think that was the right decision. He goes. Obviously, someone had to follow. I tried. I couldn't get anywhere, really. There wasn't enough interest amongst my colleagues. And so I concluded that she was going to win, and I don't want a job, but she's going to win. And what influence could I have on whoever, on the individual that becomes our next leader? And if she's going to be it, then I have to, if I backed her, then maybe she'd be more willing to listen to me. But she wasn't. And it was a mistake. I should have backed Rishi Sunak. It was a mistake. But it is what it is.
And what about her predecessor, Johnson? I mean, you had some very colourful times with him. You had Dominic Cummings getting the cops in.
I resigned twice.
I know you did. I know you did. I know you did. So I'm just gonna. I don't know, but I'm just gonna sense of, because we often have discussions about who's the worst prime minister of all time, and I think it's between those two. Truss and Johnson, and I think that Truss has left this awful economic legacy from which I don't think your party is going to recover. But Johnson has had a different sort of legacy, which is about lying, about standards in public life. And I just wondered to be interested in your take now on what it was like working alongside him.
Well, look, I refer to my resignations, and I've talked a lot about the reasons why I left, and I think people know the circumstances. But the first time when I left as Chancellor, I was really excited to be Chancellor, and having the party won the 2019 election the way it did, I I know a lot of it was about Brexit, but what I was most excited about was what Boris called sort of levelling up and bringing growth throughout the UK opportunity. And I really, I took it really seriously in that I thought what a great position to be in the government, where you're the Chancellor. I've already run 4 spending departments for that. I had a good understanding of government. And I was really interested in things like skills and infrastructure and job growth, enterprise, all this. I remember a few weeks before I resigned, I think at Christmas time, just before Christmas, I sent Boris a 20-page personal minute on how I would deliver levelling up. I went through every government department, what you would do. I said I could coordinate. I was so excited about it. And then about a month later, so I resigned. And the reason I resigned, it's documented, was that he asked me to do something with my team that I found totally unacceptable. He was under the influence of Mr. Cummings. I had been telling him that Mr. Cummings was only in it for Mr. Cummings and didn't care a damn about what the Prime Minister actually thought, or the rest of the government for that matter. Boris didn't listen to it, and I thought there was no way forward, so I left.
Do you think he read your minute?
Yeah, because he did read my minute, because after Christmas, when he came back in the new year, he gave me a copy back of the minute where he had written a lot of, actually, he did read it. To his credit, he did read it, and he had commented on a lot of the things that I said. And that's what I found with Boris, is that when sort of I would get him to talk with him one-on-one and go through things in detail and how it really works and things, he would listen, and you'd sort of get him to the right place. And you think, right, we can do something with this. I can actually do something with this. I'd go off, and probably it's Cummings, someone's got to him, and then all of a sudden it's all changed.
But it was very weird. I mean, so he was the Foreign Secretary when I was the Minister of State in the Foreign Office, and I remember going in to present the Africa strategy to him. And I did a sort of whiteboard presentation through all this stuff. And he said, absolutely terrific, 100%, 100%, we're going for this. Then he left the room, and I turned to the Permanent Secretary, the head of the Civil Service Department, and said, well, the Foreign Secretary signed off, we're good to go. And he went, well, Minister, if Boris had said he didn't like it, that would be a problem. But it's not a huge help that he said he liked it. And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, well, unfortunately, if I go in tomorrow and say Rory's Africa strategy is bullshit, he'll go 100%, 100%. On you go. So I thought he was a very, very odd man. Tell me, the big question I've got in my mind is, what in the end has gone wrong? Right? I joined with you in 2010. I am full of admiration for you and for others of our colleagues. I mean, I'm on record.
He's going to mention David Gauke again.
I worship David Gauke. I thought he was the most wonderful boss, and I really enjoyed.
He's a great minister.
Enjoyed working with him. And I think listeners listening to this will think, here is this thoughtful, competent, serious person who took his job seriously. He's got a good brain on him, and he tried to do the right thing. And yet they will also think, we're now in 2024. The Conservatives are going to almost certainly lose this election by a large margin. And the economy looks like it's going to barely grow in an entire parliament. The NHS is creaking. People are unhappy with schools. Growth is anemic. Productivity is rubbish. So how does one reconcile kind of hardworking, serious, thoughtful people in senior government departments over 14 years and the fact that many voters will go to the next election thinking these guys were hopeless?
I think you asked me what's gone wrong in whether it's, if we look obviously at our own country, but I think what I'm about to say is true of many other countries, leading democracies, whether it's in Europe, whether it's France, it's Germany, it's Italy, US, of course. And that is, in a nutshell, so it's the rise of populism, being populist. Right? There's lots of causes of that. And it's it's not like the political system isn't without fault. There have been some big divisive issues over the last couple of decades. Iraq, the expensive scandal, Brexit, we've talked about, and that in itself leads to obviously big differences of opinion. But then you get the politicians who can then just exploit that for the sake of their own populism, obviously social medias has played a big part, continues to play. I think that is to me, that sort of polarization that's being created in politics, again, not just in the UK, through populism I think that's our number one defining issue as a country going forward. And it exists not just in the Conservative Party. I mean, look at Jerry Corbyn and his legacy. I mean, Alastair couldn't even get himself to vote, Labour in one of the elections, right? In the, how powerful
very
that's
specific
been.
reasons, actually.
But yes, it's true. It's true, though.
It's true.
Right?
But just on that, so populism, Brexit driven by populism, Johnson driven by populism, Liz Truss driven by God knows what. But it's
conspiracy theories.
Now it is, but that's all part of populism as well.
Yeah.
So, so all that being said, you've been a Conservative minister, you've been in 6 government departments, and as Rory said, you'd be seen as one of the kind of sane, sensible guys. Can you honestly look people in the eye today and say, after 14 years of this government, we should give them another go?
Yes, and I'll tell you why. Because despite all of that we just discussed, if I look back last 14 years where you had constant government under Conservative leadership, if you think about I can think of 3 or 4 things that really sort of are better, have improved, right? We talked about the economy. Of course, the economy is in a difficult position today, but you find me a country in Europe where it's not. But since 2010, the UK in real terms has grown faster than any other major European country. France, Germany, Italy, Spain has grown faster than them in real terms. And that means real jobs and opportunity. If you think about education, I think our schools, our university, our colleges are much better. And that's not my view. If you look at any international measure of educational performance,
please
or
don't
maths,
mention maths and P's.
Well, look, you might not like them, but it's better than it's better than the great inflation under the Labour years, right? And I'd rather take an international measure than a domestic measure, which is much easier to manipulate. And then last one is another really important area, right? Hopefully we can agree on this one, which is the environment, right? Now, I know obviously there's a constant debate about I care deeply about the environment, what we give to our children and grandchildren. I believe passionately in the damage of climate change, declining biodiversity. But if you look as a country, we've cut our emissions faster than any other G20 country. We're in terms of renewable energy, it's grown faster than any other comparable country in Europe. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying all these areas we've done enough, but they've done a lot. Equality. I was proud to vote for same-sex marriage, and I was proud that it was a Conservative Prime Minister that brought it to Parliament. Modern slavery. We don't get to. Sometimes these things people don't, for lots of reasons, they're not the most sort of exciting topics and stuff. But we have done a lot on modern slavery, right? Because of Theresa May's leadership on that, on domestic abuse, we've done a lot on taking mental health more seriously. I know something you care about. I care about taking it more seriously. I'm not saying again it's enough. But there's been change. So there are things where there have been huge improvements.
Can I pause for a second and bring you in on this, Alastair? So, I mean, I think we're looking at a situation where Labour will win the next election. When you hear him, and I understand you'll disagree with 90% of what he says, and we know that because you tell us again and again.
But not 90%. Not really.
But do you ever sort of recognise what it must have been like for Gordon Brown in 2008, 2009, when he must also have felt, wait a sec, we've done all these things over 13 years, we're proud of our record, and yet I'm staring defeat in the face, and it's unfair.
No, honestly, even though I think Sajid did a perfectly fine job of trying to present a positive case, if you remember a speech that Gordon made in, I think it was Manchester, before the election that he lost to David Cameron, where he did, I don't know if you remember the speech, but he just read out a list that went on and on and on of real progress and real change. And I think when we had Gillian Keegan on, I think it's very hard for Conservatives to genuinely to stand there and say, this is a better, stronger, richer country than it was, or that you're going to leave it in a better state. But listen, there's no point.
But also, let's not forget that when Labour came to office in '97, they all had a big economic bonus to spend as well, right? Which was completely different.
To your spending limits for 2 years.
Exactly, and you had a big because the Conservative government, and then because John Major had made the right economic decisions finally after the ERM disaster.
On health,
you had a huge bonus to spend.
On health and education, just look at the graph that goes like that, then that, and it's now done that again. So listen, it's not all about spending, but I just think as a country, I think you agree with me, the country doesn't feel good about itself. We are more divided. We are poor. And I agree there are challenges in all these other countries. But I think, I'm afraid, particularly since Brexit and Johnson, this country has taken a very, very bad turn.
Can I bring in on health, which is a huge thing, and then back to, I promise not to do much more of this, but health is one of the really big things. Because although Alastair's right, Gordon Brown spent a lot on health, actually, Theresa May spent a lot on health, Boris Johnson spent a lot on health. I mean, we are pouring billions into the health service, and yet doesn't seem to be very much coming out the other end. I mean, it seems like an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
So let's imagine, I mean, I know you don't want to say this is going to happen, but just imagine, for the sake of argument, Wes Streeting became the health secretary and Labour was trying to run the NHS over the next 5 years. What's anyone supposed to do about the health system?
Well, first, we need to be honest, whether it's Labour, whether it's considered about the challenge of the health system. It's the biggest public policy challenge this country faces is the health system by far and away, right? Because it's so important. Health, who isn't it important to? And just to put the challenge in perspective is that, when Labour came to office in 97, it spent 27% of total day-to-day government spending went to the NHS. Now it's 44%. It's soon about to be 50% in the next 5 years.
Of total government spending.
Of total day-to-day government spending.
A lot of it at the expense of defence, which is going to have to go up.
Defence is going to have to go up for obvious reasons. Spending on interest on the government debt is going to have to go up. And there'll be other areas that probably have to go up as well. But, you take that into account. And where's the NHS going to get the money from? Today, we are spending more as a proportion, more in real terms than ever before, right? So one budget that just kept going up and up and up in real terms, even before COVID. And why is that happening is because we're living longer. When the NHS was created, there were something like 500,000 people over the age of 80. Now there's over 3 million people. There's new medicines and treatments that people rightly want. We're taking mental health more seriously than when the NHS was created. And all of that, the burden of disease has changed. And I am clear, especially having worked up close now with the NHS, having run that department, there is no way that it can continue to be funded with what it really needs in resources directly only from taxes. It's not going to happen. It doesn't happen in any other country in Europe. It doesn't happen in Canada or Australia or in Japan. I'm deliberately picking countries that have universal healthcare systems, and none of them do it this way. And that is why I've called for a royal commission on it. I think politicians just need to say, look, we know this is a massive problem. We need a consensus on it. We're not going to agree it through parliament and media. So let's get the great and the good, politicians of all sides, around the table and do this. So what should Wes Streeting do in your scenario? Let's say Labour do win the next election. They're going to have the same problem if Conservatives win the next election. They need to deal with this. We need a royal commission to sort this out. Otherwise, our children and grandchildren are going to pay for it.
And are you essentially saying there has to be a sort of hybrid system, whereas the principle that people who require healthcare should have access to that healthcare, but that the funding model is going to have to change?
Yes. And I couldn't tell you today exactly what that funding model should be, but I can point to countries that I think we can all look at and say, I don't think anyone looks at Australia or Canada to take to sort of English-speaking countries or even France or Germany and says they don't look after their sick, right? But they do it in an entirely different way. And of course, the government's involved and things. And also, by the way, these countries also take prevention much more seriously. We need to be much more serious about prevention, whether that's on mental health or obesity or cancer, and that will pay for itself in the future as well.
I completely agree with you about prevention. Just on mental health, you had a brother who took his own life.
Yeah.
And I just want you to tell listeners who he was, why, in your view, he did what he did, and what sort of effect that's had on you and the rest of your family.
Yes, my eldest brother, Tariq, and he took his own life in July 2018. Obviously, it's a long time ago, but I probably think about it every day still. We were very close. So he's one of, we were 5 brothers. We were all very close. And the truth is I didn't see it coming at all. And I remember when my other brother, Bas, who called me up and learning his death.
Police officer.
He's now in the Home Office. He's the Director General of Immigration Enforcement.
Oh my God.
That's a tough job.
So we'll see him at Select Committee soon.
But he was police officer for 30 years. And and he called me up and said, are you okay? I got some serious news. And I just visited my mother. I was in a car being driven by my protection officer. I was Home Secretary at the time, back to London, and he told me the news. And I was totally, even shocked and devastated. Sounds is an understatement, because we just didn't see it coming. And I wish obviously I've learned more. I wish I'd done more to try and prevent it, in the way that just talk to my brother more. I'd seen him before, I think 2 weeks before that, at a family wedding, and everything, to me seemed normal, but I only learned afterwards he had some serious health issues, including some mental health issues, and I didn't talk to him enough, and I should have, and I regret it.
Is there a Pakistan Punjabi cultural thing about not talking about mental health that's part of that, do you think?
There is. It's not just Pakistan. I think there's a sort of Asian, if I can call it that, Asian sort of subcontinent sort of issue here. I've talked to people, not just since then. I've campaigned a lot on suicide prevention. I will continue to do so. I've talked to a lot of people, all communities, but including from like the Sikh community, Pakistani community, and others. And there's a serious taboo about not talking about it. Still, yeah, there is. And
so
it's
when
wrong.
You say you wish you could have done more, what do you actually think you could have done?
I think if I just, of course I was busy. I was the Home Secretary. I was busy, but I shouldn't have been so busy that I couldn't sort of sit down with my brother one-on-one, go out for a lunch, something, say, what's on your mind? What are the issues? What's going on? And just probed it. And I think if I'd done that, I would have learned more. I think my other brothers would say the same thing as well. And my number one, and since then I've learnt more about suicide prevention. Some great charities that do obviously amazing work in this space, but through them I've learnt more. I think probably the number one thing I've learned is just to talk more, get people to open up more, especially men. 75% of suicides in this country are men, and obviously there are other risk factors. There's regional differences. Suicide rates are twice as high in the northeast, for example, than other parts of the UK. Deprivation areas compared to affluent areas 10 times higher. So there are risk factors, and that's why ever since my brother's death from this, I thought I need to do more. When I became health secretary, it meant I was in a position to try and do more, and that's why I set off work on doing a national, government-wide suicide prevention strategy, which eventually has been published. I asked the Treasury for more money and support, which they've done. I hope there'll be even more in the budget that's coming up. And also, I, like so many things in government, I think you can do more if you do cross-government work, and it's not just the health department, but the education department, DWP, and stuff, trying to get more joined-up policies on this. But it's as I say, it's an area that obviously I'll be leaving sometime this year in politics in terms of Parliament. But this is one thing I'm just going to keep trying to do what I can.
Good.
I run against you in the leadership, and of the final group of us that were at that BBC stage, you were the one that I would have been most happy to see as Prime Minister. But it didn't. But it didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Why? And I think you had 3 leadership runs. Why did you not become Prime Minister?
Well, ultimately, it was I didn't get the support. But why did that happen? I think in each one of those, there's different factors. I mean, it's not that. That's my. I only tried twice myself, and one was the occasion that you mentioned, where I did make some progress, but clearly not enough. I think in that particular election, I think actually it was for Boris Johnson to lose right from the start. Right? I think you probably agree with that. It was for whatever reason, the whole momentum was on his side, and for me to win, for Rory, you to win, I think something would have had to go wrong with his campaign. Right? Otherwise, no one else was going to win. And then later. When I tried after Boris Johnson himself had quit, the support wasn't there. I've tried to sort of think back and what are the reasons. I think one major reason was just actually a really practical thing in my case. Obviously, I was health secretary. There's a massive job to be done. I came in during the lockdown, and I took my job like very, very, very seriously. I thought I had to, and then we had the Omicron crisis. And I the job was understandably, rightly all-consuming. I didn't have any time at all, even if I wanted to sort of campaign a bit behind the scenes. And I think that the reality is whenever you have leadership elections, the eventual winners or the serious contenders have been doing a lot of work whilst they before the leadership election actually starts.
So what do we learn from the fact that Liz Truss became Prime Minister and you and I didn't? What is it about her personality, her style that made her?
I think you could add Boris Johnson to that. I mean, anybody who knows Boris Johnson, certainly as long as I have, knows that he would have been a complete disaster.
Well, I think the one difference, at least in Boris's case, I think most people would agree. Whatever you might think, you Alastair, of his politics, that he's a great campaigner. He was very good with people in terms of make them feel good, get support. He's a very good campaigner.
No, I sort of understand us being beaten by Boris Johnson, but being
you
beaten by Liz
apply
Truss
that to Liz Truss
is tougher. Right?
I think that the particular, what had a big role to play in that was the particular circumstances of Boris Johnson's departure. So it's I'm not giving anything away that Boris and Rishi weren't the best of friends when Boris left government, and I think the team around him were determined that it's anyone but Rishi, and they had to find someone to focus on rather than to have to spread that support too thinly, and they, for whatever reason, they chose Liz Truss, and I think that was probably the number one reason why she won, because of all that support.
But the reason I guess this is important is that we desperately need good leadership. And one of the reasons I think why the Conservatives will lose the next election is that 44 days with Liz Truss totally destroyed our major calling card, which was supposed to be economic credibility.
Yeah, big damage to our reputations, no question about that.
And as soon as that happened, it becomes very, very difficult, right? Because we're supposed to be the party of prudence, sense, thoughtfulness.
The political parties have a brand.
Yeah.
As well as, they have lots of things, but they have a brand, and the brand was trashed.
So what could you change structurally in the system to make it more likely that
Rory became Prime Minister?
No, that you became Prime Minister, that David Gauke became Prime Minister, I don't know, but not Liz Truss. I mean, what structurally needs to be changed?
I'm not sure, actually, I'm not sure what structural changes can be made, because ultimately it's the MPs that make the sort of shortlist, it's the members that vote. Members that join any political party, by definition, obviously they're more interested than the average person in politics. They've got pretty defined views, and it's the members that led to Liz Truss. It's the members that experimented with Jeremy Corbyn and things. So I mean, this is not just a unique sort of Conservative Party challenge.
Do you agree with Rory that the Tories have lost the next election?
Not completely. I think that it's going to be incredibly difficult. And for the reasons we've discussed, whether it's brand and stuff, and the COVID and war in Ukraine and inflation that's come about because of that, it's going to be very tough. But I think this is that when the election comes sometime this year, that the choice in front of people is either going to be Keir Starmer as your Prime Minister or Rishi, and I think that's a pretty stark choice, and I think a lot of people yet still haven't made up their mind. So,
when you say
I wouldn't want to be complacent. You've got to work. You've got to keep working at it. Keep working hard, and I think things will be a lot closer.
Why is it a stark choice? Because from distance, most of the public be like, they seem completely identical. It's like a slightly boring banker against a slightly boring lawyer.
Or Labour. And also, Keir Starmer, of course, he's not Jeremy Corbyn, right? He's not Jeremy Corbyn, nothing like him. I mean, I happen to think Keir Starmer is a decent guy. If I woke up the day after the election and Keir Starmer was standing outside 10 Downing Street, I'm not gonna be frightened, right? And
which you would have been with Corbyn,
if Jeremy Corbyn had.
Yeah.
But he's also not Tony Blair. Right?
Yeah,
you're on the doorstep.
But Rishi Sunak's not Margaret Thatcher, is
I'm
he?
not saying he is, but I'm saying Keir Starmer is not Tony Blair. There's no love for him on the doorstep, and he's got his work cut out for him.
Sajid, I'm getting told that you have to go because you've been unbelievably generous with your time. But just a couple of things. First is Rory and I were at an event yesterday with 1,000 people there, business people, and we asked them the same question. And I'm a bit with you. I think it's never over until it's over. But to a man and woman, every single one of them said, it's all over. Anyway, can I just ask one final question in relation to your time as Home Secretary? We talked about this on the podcast last week. I do find the Shamima Begum thing. I know
Mm.
it's really complicated and difficult, and it's unfair in a way to say finally.
Yeah.
But I do have difficulties with the idea that she is now literally stateless. That and what that means for her, and what it says about our justice system as well. So, just like your reflections on that.
Well, I'm not going to talk about that particular case, and there's a reason I can't talk about her or her particular case, but I will address what I think is the point that you raised, and because there's still a legal case going on, but the general point where whether it was that individual or others, there are many people that left the UK to fight against the UK and others as terrorists. And the question is then, how do you sort of deal with that, particularly when they are planning to or want to come back to the UK? And I first, when I reflect on that, I wish there were more tools in the box. If you're Home Secretary, I wish there was more I could do. But the in terms of the legal tools are what they are, right? They weren't designed, for the situation I think that we faced as a country. And by the way, I did. People then asked me, why didn't you try to change the tools? I did bring a Counter-Terrorism Act to Parliament. I created more tools like the Designated Areas Initiative and stuff like that. But I couldn't use them retrospectively. So you find as Home Secretary, you only have a limited set of tools, and some of them can be quite blunt. And where you have an individual that has gone abroad, worked with terrorists. And again, I can't talk about the particular case, but where then on that, and you receive advice, you're the Home Secretary, and you receive advice from your counter-terrorism officials, from counter-terrorism policing, and from MI5. And it's absolutely, for all three, that absolutely clear that a particular individual, if you let them back into the UK, you won't be able to prosecute them. Is there... you can't, even in the evidence that you have, you can't present in front of a court because a variety of reasons, but mainly it would compromise your sources, put them in danger. So you have evidence, but you can't use it in court. It won't hold up. And so you can't prosecute them, but they're a serious danger to British people. Serious danger. And they're all in agreement. Now, you're the Home Secretary. I think... I'd be very confident saying this. I think if you think of all recent Home Secretaries, Conservative and Labour, I think they would all make exactly the same decision that I made, especially to finish that off, especially when you're being told, obviously, because you need to make sure every decision you make, especially a tough one like this, is lawful, and you're being told by your lawyers that this is a lawful decision, you're perfectly within your rights to make it, because you mentioned the stateless point. And as we've seen with the case that you've mentioned, without going into detail of it, that's been through courts many times, and the recent judgment was on all 5 counts that my decision was challenged. And all 5, the judges were unanimous that it was a correct procedural decision and it was lawful.
And have they seen the advice?
Yes, yes, and that's the thing. The judges have seen, and the court before them as well, which is a closed special immigration court. They get to see the advice that I saw. The public will never see that.
But why couldn't a court? Why couldn't you have there are courts that can deal with that sort of thing.
There are, and these courts did.
Right.
They've received that information.
But so in which case, why couldn't you be brought back to face justice?
Because there's, again, I don't want to get to that particular case, but it wouldn't have worked.
Final one for me. This is a show about politics, and people who listen to it are passionately interested in the mechanisms of politics and how it works. You came in from the outside, having had a big professional career elsewhere, including in other countries. What does the public not see about the reality of being a politician? And in particular, to finish on a bit of a downer, what are the negative aspects of being a politician? What are the things that the public doesn't quite understand, which makes it perhaps a strange job, a difficult job when you look back on these 14 years?
Well, I'll say 2 things. One is that no matter how, when you look from the outside in, no matter how obvious the problem seems, we've talked about so many challenges today, health service and protecting our country and all this. Once you're in government and obviously you may be the minister, but obviously you've got lots of other checks and balances and people with important views and power, whether non-public bodies, Parliament itself, of course, and others. Things are a lot more sort of nuanced and complex than they might look the outside to actually get stuff done. It's just not that straightforward. And someone might say, why don't you just knock it through, get it done? But you have other, like, for example, you want to change something significant, you've got to consult on it. It can be really annoying. You've got to consult. It could be a year, it could be 2 years or whatever. You consult and you just want to get it done. But the logical, in a democracy, you want to consult, but there might be people on the other side and you've got to hear their views. So it can get annoying, but there are sort of barriers in the way to making quick progress. The second thing your question makes me think of is the personal toll that politics takes on individuals, particularly if you're look at just this last few days. There's more support for protecting MPs. In all parties, MPs are coming under unprecedented levels of unacceptable abuse, physical abuse, people turning up at home. We've had 2 MPs sadly murdered in the last few years. And so there's a personal toll on all politicians, whether you're a minister or not. But obviously, when you're a minister and now you're making decisions, your politics is all about making decisions. And when you make a decision, there will be someone always on the other side that doesn't agree with you. Now, I happen to think like 95% of the cases, 99% of the cases, people sort of accept that, right? They're not going to come and attack you for it, either verbally or physically. But there are also a small group of people that can still add up to tens of thousands of people that don't accept that. And at best, they are, verbally abusive to you. I still do. I get abuse. You look at my social media time, I get abuse all the time, racist abuse, all sorts of, but also they want to really hurt you. I had death threats all the time. I was a protected person for years and things, and still have level of protection because there's the people really want to hurt you because you had to make decisions. And that is, I'd say to anyone that ever thinks about getting into politics is be prepared to make decisions. And don't think it's all like you just get the benefit of that. There will always be people that disagree with you, and you have to be ready for that.
Yeah, but that's a more hopeful message than the one in your book, Rory. Which because you're still saying you should go and do it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely. I don't look back and have any regrets at all, despite everything I've said on your program today. What I've just finished with, in that I would do it all over again because you want good people. And good people exist in all the major political parties, and you want them to come forward to make their case and do their best for the country. You need more of those people. Otherwise, you will get, if those people pull out, you get more of the divisive lot, and we don't want that.
Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for your candour.
Good, thank you very much.
Good luck in whatever you're going to do afterwards.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
It's great. So one of my other kind of minor political heroes, Sajid Javid.
Sorry, hold on. David Gauke, major political hero?
Obviously nobody.
Theresa May, major political.
Nobody ranks alongside David Gauke, but Sajid is somebody who I really liked and admired, and I think, I think on a live show once you asked who I would hope would be the next prime minister after Rishi before he announced stepping down, and I mentioned Sajid. So anyway, that's just to say, what did you think? What do you think of him?
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I felt really bad because I knew he had to get away, but I just kept having more things I wanted to talk about. I think people would have found that very, very interesting. I do think it's different. It's your point that you've made a lot about somebody having a different modus operandi in these sorts of interviews, if they're in government or if they're not. And I just honestly think if more politicians in government talked like they think they can't talk when they are in government. I mean, okay, he's obviously angry about the Lee Anderson thing, but he could have just said that. But the fact that he then leapt on your point about Anas, about Sadiq, about Hamza Yusuf, and said these have become friends of his, I think that's what politicians should be saying about each other when it's true, as opposed to I'm Labour, he's Tory, therefore he's bad and I'm good.
I think you've put your finger on my big takeaway. I think that was Sajid communicating really well. Many people listening will sympathise, will take him seriously. I'm afraid it's much better than he often did in his early political career doing communications. He was incredibly much a party line man. He never voted against government. He, I was sad when we ran leadership that, having been, on my side on things like being against proroguing Parliament, being against Boris, he then decided to endorse Boris, support...
And said he supported no deal Brexit as well.
Yeah, support no deal Brexit. So, and I think it's very difficult judging a colleague on this stuff, because there will be many, many things in his life which will have made him feel that he couldn't afford to rebel, and that those jobs meant a lot to him. But I just feel if he'd somehow let the real Sajid out earlier, it would have been phenomenal if you'd been able to hear what he sort of really is when he's no longer trying to become a minister.
And it was, I know that some people just listen to us and some people watch on YouTube and what have you. I think that one is definitely worth watching, because his facial reactions, for example, whenever I mention Johnson, his as soon as I reminded him that he voted for Liz Truss, there was sort of, leant back in his chair. And,
well, I thought, but it's also, a very unusual politician to say, I was completely wrong, she was a total disaster.
And that was one of my worst ever mistakes.
Yeah.
And owning the fact, because the fact is, if people hadn't voted for her, she wouldn't have become leader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. So thank you for that. And I'd be interesting to see what he does next. And in a sense, a lost parliament. I mean, that's the other thing we didn't really get into, because he finished with an optimistic story. But obviously, it's not like it used to be in politics, where somebody like that would spend 30, 40 years. He's obviously done his, 14 years, and then he's going to leave and do something else. Maybe no bad thing.
I thought his defence of 14 years was not the strongest.
No, but but to be fair to him,
at least he did it.
He needs to defend. He's a Conservative MP. He's not someone like me who left the party and became an independent. And I think it's good for listeners to hear him defend. And I think he's sincere. I think he genuinely does think that Labour would not have done a better job over the last 14 years than the Conservatives. And I think those things that he talks about, I think he feels sincerely. The problem is that the big picture is all wrong. I mean, it's absolutely right. Of course, they brought in gay marriage. Of course, they did the first commitment to net zero. Of course, they did a huge amount of transitions on energy. But the big picture is we're going to get to the end of this parliament and people in real terms will be poorer than they were at the beginning of the parliament.
And I didn't want to get into a kind of he said, she said, but I think you could match all sorts of statistics against those. And on net zero, I mean, we're talking about a prime minister who's deliberately reversed his strategy. So no, I wasn't. Well, but at least he tried.
Yeah, and it's not that he's trying to campaign or particularly win people over. He's just trying to make the case, and I think it's worth making the case. I mean, I really feel this, that the idea that all Conservative ministers were a bunch of sort of evil incompetents who did nothing other than screw up the country isn't fair. I genuinely think he and many of them were working hard and trying hard. It's just the end total result is that Labour's going to be the next government.
No, but the other place where this is important, and this is a lesson that Labour should learn if they do get into government, and then hopefully a long time in the future get out of government, having politicians that are prepared to defend your historical record is actually more important than people realise.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons, I think, why we've not been in power for such a long time.
Just quickly to finish on that, because one of the issues was that actually Labour after 2010 were not as active as they should have been defending.
Not at all.
New Labour, defending Tony Blair.
And so that when austerity happened, rather, yes, they pushed against austerity up to a point, but actually there was a little bit of, maybe we did leave a bit of a mess, maybe we didn't regulate the banks enough, and as opposed to, and then of course once Corbyn became leader, the Blair Brown era was like an aberration.
So it would be it'd be very, very dangerous if the Conservatives lose this election to then spend the next 5-10 years crapping on their record in office.
I think you have to alight on those things that you think you did well, as he was trying to do.
Yeah.
But don't allow yourself to be defined utterly negatively, because if you do, you'll pay a historical price into the future.
Well, thank you very much, Alastair.
It's good.